Magic the Gathering is a game intended for people age 13 and up. Needless to say, these videos are intended for the same audience. If you're a kid, these videos aren't for you, and you should turn them off now. With that out of the way, let's jump in. Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Commander Adventures in 2020. 2019 was a great year of growth for the channel, and we look forward to see what 2020 will bring. I figured we'd start the new year right, with a game featuring the majority of my original EDH playgroup. However, the original footage for this game was just shy of 2 hours, so let's not waste any more time and quickly go through introductions. First off, we have Danny, rummaging his way to the finish alongside Anje Falkenrath. It's a Madness deck, which uses its Madness cards more to fuel Anya's ability, while digging for one of Rakdos's many infinite combos. We then have RJ, showing off his mostly foiled out Omnath Locus of Mana deck. It's a green stompy deck, which focuses on overwhelming his opponents through mana generation. We have Michael returning to the channel, alongside his Riku of Two Reflections deck. It's still focused heavily on instants and sorceries, with creatures providing the extra value he needs to pull ahead. And finally we have George, returning from Exile alongside Ghired. He's looking to make a huge comeback from his last game, and still wants to overrun his opponents with a large board of tokens. Alright, let's jump into gameplay. Danny starts us off. He drops an Acume Refuge, and gains a life before passing. RJ drops a Forest. Michael drops a Command Tower. George drops a tapped Canopy Vista. Danny drops his own Command Tower. At his end step, RJ casts a Worldly Tutor, and puts an Azusa Lostwood Seeking on top of his library. RJ draws Azusa, and then drops a Forest before passing off. Michael drops a Mountain. He then uses it to cast a Mana Vault. He finishes off his turn by casting an Explosive Vegetation to bring in a Forest and an Island tapped. George drops a Reliquary Tower before passing. Danny drops a Swamp. He finishes up by casting his commander, Anya. RJ doesn't want to be outdone, so he drops a Forest before casting his own commander, Omnath Locus of Mana. Michael chooses not to untap Mana Vault during his upkeep, and then takes the damage. He drops a tapped Stomping Ground, and then casts a Growth Spiral. He draws, and puts an island into play during resolution. He then closes out his turn by casting an Izzet Signet. George drops a Spire Garden. He then taps out to cast a Chromatic Lantern. At his end step, Danny rummages with Anya 3 times. For those who don't know, Anya has an activated ability which allows Danny to tap her and discard a card to draw a card. If the card he discards has Madness, Anya also triggers and untaps herself. In essence, allowing Danny to continue to rummage until he runs out of Madness cards. I tried to keep his activations as short as possible this game, but I'm kinda curious. When players have a bunch of repetitive actions they do, would you guys like to see that in the video? Or would you prefer a quick card with a voiceover saying what happened? On top of that, do you like seeing things like the untap phase, and tapping mana to cast spells? Or would you prefer they were cut out to speed up the games? I tell you what, I'll leave a pair of polls up in the card up top, so please let me know what you think, and you guys can help to shape the channel. Danny drops a Mountain. He then uses it to cast a Rakdos Signet. Finally, he closes out his turn by casting a Tormenting Voice, discarding a Dual Caster Mage, and drawing 2. RJ drops a Forest for turn. He casts a Vernal Bloom before passing. Michael pays to untap Mana Vault on his upkeep thanks to Vernal Bloom. He then drops a tapped Breeding Pool. He casts a Thrasios, and passes so we can see what everyone else is up to. George untaps. He drops a Forest, and casts an Explosive Vegetation, which he uses to bring in a pair of Forests tapped. He then follows up by casting a Growing Rites of Itlimoc. He reveals a Vorinclex to its trigger, and passes. At his end step, Danny rummages once, discarding an Alms of the Vein, which he chooses to cast, targeting RJ. Danny moves to his turn. He drops a mountain and casts a Dark Ritual. He then follows it up with an Alhamrit's Archive. He then passes. RJ casts a Beast Whisperer. He follows up with Azusa and draws a card off the Whisperer before passing. At his end step, Michael activates Thrasios and scries a card to the bottom of his library before revealing a Manamorphose. Michael then moves to his turn and pays to untap Mana Vault on his upkeep. In his main one, he casts a Manamorphose and adds back the mana he spent to cast it before drawing a card. He follows up with the Dockside Extortionist and gets a total of 5 treasures from its ETB. He then cracks one of the treasures to cast a Clever Impersonator. He has it enter as a copy of Danny's Alhamrit's Archive and passes. George cast a Mirari's Wake. With Mirari's Wake, Chromatic Lantern, and Vernal Bloom in play, George can now tap any of his forests for any color of mana. When he does, he adds an additional green thanks to Vernal Bloom, and then chooses to add either a green or a mana of the color he tapped for thanks to Mirari's Wake. George then finishes up his turn with a Doubling Season. At his end step, Danny rummages once. We then move to Danny's turn. He drops Sanctum of Eternity and passes. RJ untaps. He casts his own copy of Growing Rites and reveals an Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger to its trigger. He follows up with a Vizier of the Menagerie and draws off of Beast Whisperer. In response to the draw trigger, Michael activates Thrasios. He reveals an Urban Evolution and draws it and an additional card thanks to Alhamrit's. RJ then moves to end step, and Growing Rites transforms into Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun. Still at end step, Danny rummages twice with Anja. After he regains priority at his end step, RJ casts a Naturalize to destroy George's Doubling Season. Michael takes a damage from his tapped Mana Vault. He then casts an Urban Evolution. In response, Danny casts Bedevil to destroy Michael's copy of Archive. Michael then draws 3 and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Sensei's and uses the mana floating from Vernal Bloom to activate it. He rearranges the top 3 of his library and activates Thrasios, scrying a card he didn't want away and putting an island into play tapped. He then loses a life to City of Brass to cast a copy of Seedborn Muse. In response, Danny rummages twice with Anja. Michael then passes off. George untaps, and Michael untaps alongside him. George drops the Plains and moves to cast a Phyrexian Rebirth. Michael responds by casting a Mission Briefing. He puts both cards he surveils into his graveyard and casts a Mystic Confluence, choosing to counter Phyrexian Rebirth unless George pays 9. George is able to pay, and priority passes on Phyrexian Rebirth again. In response, Danny rummages with Anja, and then Michael activates Thrasios twice, putting in a tapped Rootbound Crag with the first, and a tapped Island with the second. Phyrexian Rebirth finally resolves, the board is wiped, and George creates an 8/8 Phyrexian Horror, which looks suspiciously like a lizard. Down most of his mana thanks to Mystic Confluence, George finishes off his turn before passing. Danny untaps. He drops a mountain, and then casts a Neheb Dreadhorde General, before passing off. RJ drops a forest. He casts Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, and exiles Mirari's Wake and Alhamrit's Archive on cast. He then passes. Michael pays to untap Mana Vault on his upkeep. He casts a Coalition Relic, and then activates Sensei's to rearrange the top 3 of his library. He follows up by casting a Spellseeker. He goes to tutor up a pull from tomorrow, and then remembers he wanted to tap top to draw the top card of his library. The table allows this since it's a casual game, and he didn't alter the order of the top of his library. He then passes off. George casts Arishkar's Expertise. He draws 8, and then casts a Skyshroud Claim for free as part of the resolution. He brings in a Forest, and a Cinder Glade untapped, and then drops a Plains for turn. He follows up with a Parallel Lives. He then casts his commander, Ghired, and creates 2 Rhinos as he enters. He moves to end step, and flips Growing Rights into Cradle. Danny drops a Dragon Skull Summit. He moves to combat, and swings Neheb at Michael for 5. On damage, he discards a total of 5 cards, to draw 5 cards, and add 5 red mana. In main 2, he recasts Anya. He then finishes up his turn by casting a Bone Miser. RJ casts an Avenger of Zendikar in main 1. He creates 5/0/1 plants. Now that he's used Avenger as a ramp spell, he taps Itlamok to cast Worldbreaker, exiling Parallel Lives on cast. He then casts a One Volley Beast Tracker, and puts his own copy of Vorinclex on top of his library with its ETB. At end step, Michael takes a damage from City of Brass, and floats all of his mana to cast a Turnabout. He untaps all of his lands, and takes the damage to tap out again. He then funnels all of his mana into a pull from tomorrow where X is 16. He draws 16 cards, and then discards a Guided Passage as part of the resolution before moving to his turn. Michael drops a Forest, as George drops a Mountain thanks to Burgeoning. Michael then sacrifices the Forest he dropped as part of the cost to cast a Crop Rotation. He then brings in a Reliquary Tower with its effect. He casts his own commander Riku, and casts a copied River's Rebuke targeting both RJ and George. He remembers to tap his Forest while Vernal Bloom is still in play, and then both RJ and George's non-land permanents are bounced to hand. Michael then moves to cast a Rude Awakening. In response, Danny rummages with Anya, draws an additional card from Bone Miser, and casts the Psychotic Episode he discarded. He puts Michael's Regrowth on the bottom of his library, and then Rude Awakening resolves, untapping all of Michael's lands, as Danny remembers to untap Anya since he discarded a Madness card. Michael follows up with a Mirage Mirror. He then casts an Unexpected Results, and shuffles his library. After shuffling, he reveals a Nexus of Fate from the top. Danny tries to Red Elemental Blast Nexus, but Michael is ready with a Swan Song. Danny gets a 2/2 bird, and Michael makes what is probably a crucial error by not using Riku's triggered ability to copy Nexus and give himself 2 extra turns. The stack resolves, and Nexus gets shuffled in as a 2/2 bird flies in from off-screen. Michael then loses a life to make Mirage Mirror a copy of Mana Vault. He then uses it to cast a Fact or Fiction. He reveals Nexus off the top after shuffling and offering cuts, but everyone refuses to believe him and makes him shuffle again. He chooses George to make his piles, and takes a pile with Gamble, Veldalken Orrery, and Anticipate, while binning Isochron Scepter and Lotus Petal. As he prepares to move to his extra turn, George casts a Sundering Growth to destroy his Mirage Mirror. Michael takes the damage from Mana Vault. He drops a Mana Confluence, and then casts a Chromatic Lantern. He then misses the damage from City of Brass to cast an Intuition. He copies it with Riku, and then goes to resolve the copy. He pulls Regrowth, Eternal Witness, and Mana Severance, and RJ gives him the Mana Severance. He then resolves the original Intuition to pull Phyrexian Metamorph, Days Undoing, and Snapcaster Mage. And George gives him Days Undoing. Michael casts Mana Severance, and goes through his library, exiling the remainder of his lands to ensure he hits nothing but gas at this point. Since this is going to take a moment, Danny agrees not to interact with it, and breaks priority order to rummage with Anja a total of 5 times, gaining 4 extra draws, and a zombie token from Bone Miser as he does. Michael then casts a Day's Undoing, and in response, Danny rummages with Anja and creates a zombie token. Day's Undoing resolves, and as everyone shuffles in their hands and graveyards while drawing a new 7, we'll be right back.
Giant growth.
Day's Undoing then exiles itself as it ends the turn. George drops a Windswept Heath. He cracks it and loses a life to go and grab a forest. He then casts a Soul Ring. He follows it up with a Doubling Season. He then casts a Hornet Queen. In response, Danny rummages with Anja 3 times, and draws 2 extra and creates a zombie from Bone Miser. George then creates 8 1/1 green insects with Death Touch thanks to Doubling Season. He taps Itlamok, and convokes with 3 creatures to cast a Chord of Calling. He brings in an Indestructible Avacyn with Chord, and finishes up with a Sylvan Library before passing to Danny. At end step, Danny rummages with Anja twice, and creates a zombie and 2 black mana from Bone Miser. He then cycles Canyon Slough with that mana, draws a card, and creates an additional 2 black mana from Bone Miser. We then move to Danny's turn. He drops a Smoldering Marsh, and then casts a Faithless Looting. He draws 2, and pitches 2 Swamps, triggering Bone Miser for 4 black mana. He uses that mana to cast an Archfiend of Ifnir, as the creature decks at the table let out a collective groan. He then moves to combat, and hits RJ for 5 with Neheb. On damage, he discards 5, draws 5, and adds 5 red mana, all from Neheb. Then a crap ton of Bone Miser triggers happen, giving him 2 zombies, 2 more draws, and 2 black mana which fizzles as he leaves combat. Then Archfiend of Ifnir triggers, and adds 5 neg1 counters to every creature his opponents control. In main 2, Danny overloads a Vandal Blast, destroying each of his opponent's artifacts which can be destroyed. He then rummages with Anja 4 times, triggers Bone Miser for 2 extra draws and 2 zombies, and triggers Archfiend of Ifnir to wipe any remaining creatures. He casts a Solemn Simulacrum, and puts a Swamp in tapped. As Danny moves to clean up, each non-land card he discards triggers Bone Miser for a draw. When the draw trigger resolves, he is still above his maximum hand size, so he has to discard down again. Hypothetically, he could rummage through his entire deck here, as long as he kept drawing a non-land card to discard, but he only ends up doing it a total of 3 times. RJ untaps. He drops a Forest, and casts a Genesis Wave for 4. He puts 3 forests, and a Defense of the Heart into play, and passes off. Michael untaps. He casts an Intuition, and in response, Danny casts a Red Elemental Blast. In response to that, Michael loses 2 life to cast a Steam Augury. He makes his piles, and RJ gives him the one with Seedborn Muse, Simic Signet, and Gamble, while he bins Imperial Recruiter and Factor Fiction. Intuition is then countered by Red Elemental Blast. Michael finishes up his turn with the Simic Signet. At his end step, Danny rummages with Anja, discarding an Alms of the Vein, and casts it, targeting George before drawing 2. He rummages again, and creates a zombie from Bone Miser. George untaps. He uses Sylvan Library's trigger, and takes 8 to keep his extra draws. He casts an Avenger of Zendikar, and debates even bothering to get out the token for the 0/1 plants he creates. Danny decides to allow him to keep them, so George creates 28 plants. He then drops a mountain, and puts a +1/+1 counter on each of them. He floats 28 green mana with Itlimoc, and casts a Rampant Growth. In response, Danny rummages with Anja, and creates 2 mana from Bone Miser while triggering Archfiend for a neg1/neg1 counter. George then brings in a tapped Forest, and puts another round of +1/+1 counters. He then casts a Nature's Lore to do the same thing. A Skyshroud Claim follows up for a Forest, a tapped Temple Garden, and 2 rounds of counters. He then casts Ghired, and creates 2 Rhinos as he enters. George then resigns himself to his fate, and passes off to Danny. Danny untaps. On his upkeep, Michael casts a Turnabout, choosing to tap down his creatures. In response, Danny rummages with Anja a total of 5 times, creating 3 zombies, an additional draw, and 2 black mana during his upkeep. And also effectively undoing George's entire last turn with Archfiend of Ifnir. Turnabout then resolves, and taps down all of his creatures. Danny drops a mountain, and bounces Anja back to hand with Sanctum of Eternity. He recasts her, and rummages 3 times. None of what happens on his rummages matter, because his final one sees him discard a Worldgorger Dragon. He casts an Animate Dead, and with no responses from the table, returns Worldgorger Dragon to play. Worldgorger Dragon exiles all of his other permanents as it enters the battlefield, including Animate Dead. When Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, it causes Danny to sacrifice Worldgorger Dragon, who in turn returns all of his permanents to play. This in turn returns Animate Dead, which he chooses to have enter enchanting Worldgorger Dragon. As Animate Dead goes to return Worldgorger, Danny is able to tap all of his now untapped lands for mana, and also tap Anja to rummage through his deck until he finds Molten Disaster. He then casts it, where X equals 32, with the kicker paid so it has split second. This eliminates his opponents, and he walks away with a win. Game review. This is without a doubt the longest game we've recorded to date. Had Michael copied Nexus of Fate with Riku, he would have had an additional extra turn with his opponents tapped out to stabilize and most likely dig for a win. Aside from that, his Riku deck performed pretty much according to plan. RJ was doing fine on mana with Vernal Bloom and Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun until an early game board wipe pretty much undid all of his progress. From there, he was pretty much caught in a loop of beginning to rebuild before getting wiped again. Speaking of a loop of destruction, George just kept getting stuck as well. If anything, he showed how resilient Ghired can be as a deck. He was able to build a large board state, turn after turn, despite several board wipes, and constantly being the target of removal. Finally, we're left with Danny. He ended up with a win this week, but at what cost? Anja is very clearly a powerful combo commander, but personally I'm a bit disappointed with her. She feels less like a true madness-oriented commander, and more like a draw engine. The majority of Anja decks I've seen run their madness cards simply to discard them, rather than actually casting them. Although it seems strong, it also seems very fragile and disruptible, and also a bit unfun to play. I actually had a similar problem when I built Feather. It felt like I spent more of my gameplay digging through my deck for my win cons, rather than playing and interacting with the game. At the end of the day though, that's a personal opinion on my part, and Danny was more than able to walk away with a win here. As always, I want to thank all of the players for being a part of this game, and to give a shout out to Dungeon Games for allowing us to film. If you enjoyed this video, let us know by leaving a like and a comment, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to see more of our Commander content. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, so let us know if there's anything you'd like us to do when we reach that milestone. I look forward to seeing you next week, where we feature a game full of graveyard shenanigans. And as always, thank you for watching.